What is your favorite genre of game? FPS games? Puzzle games? How about platforming games? There are so many distinct types of games, and every year there are all sorts of unique game genres that become popular. From thrilling race games to relaxing fishing games, every genre of video game offers a variety of gameplay and styles for every single gamer to choose from. There's always a game for every type of gamer. As I have said before, and I will continue to say again, my favorite genre of video game is platformers. I enjoy the skill that platforming requires, which makes every platforming game I play feel rewarding, and always makes me want more. Throughout the vast sea of games that are spread throughout the gaming world, there's one thing that can make a game feel extremely rewarding, that being a challenge. Whether a game revolves around killing enemies to reach the end of a level in a high-stakes environment, or memorizing the mechanics of a game to best solve a puzzle, there are many ways that a game can provide a challenge. Every single challenging game that I beat makes me feel accomplished, because I was able to overcome all the difficulties I faced throughout the game. Many of my favorite games are full of grueling challenges that can make them feel like a treat for me to complete. Games such as Ultra Kill and Super Meat Boy have given me lots of trouble, but my favorite example of a game feeling rewarding because it is challenging to the player is the game Celeste. Celeste is a member of my favorite genre of games, platformers. Dodging obstacles to reach the end of a level just to be challenged again at the end is a rewarding experience that Celeste does well. Where most platforming games are super easy, Celeste is a challenge throughout the entire game, featuring dozens of secrets and surprises one must face if they wish to complete the game's hardest challenges. Throughout the game, players get introduced to new mechanics and gimmicks that make each level feel unique, adding on to the skills the player gained from the previous level. Within Celeste, you play as Madeline, as they face their anxiety while they attempt to climb all the way to the summit of Celeste Mountain, facing various challenges along the way. The story of Celeste does a fantastic job of tying into the gameplay, providing a change in tone from the constant dying that many first-time Celeste players face on their first playthrough. Something happens in every chapter that challenges the player and Madeline, showing the struggles they face as they climb to the top of the mountain. This game does an excellent job of pacing the challenges without giving the player too much trouble too fast. Celeste is one of my favorite games, but without the challenges that are inside of it, the game would never be as fun as it normally is, and would not feel as rewarding. Throughout the game, most of what makes Celeste fun and rewarding are the challenges the player must face throughout their playthrough. To show the beauty of challenges in Celeste, I'm going to talk about how the story, map designs, bonus content, and the Farewell DLC add to the challenge and make Celeste a notable example of how challenge can be rewarding inside of a game. The prelude is the tutorial for the game. It shows the player how to move, climb, and dash, all being the core mechanics of the game, which are then expanded upon in every level following it. The prelude is where the players are introduced to the old woman, who is also known as Granny. Granny is one of the residents who lives on Celeste Mountain, telling Madeline that they don't want to climb the mountain because they may see things they do not want to see. This level is not difficult, but it helps tie the game and the story together through the small amount of dialogue seen in this super short level. After beating it, the game says some motivational words which are directed towards Madeline, but are also important for the player to remember while they struggle through future levels. After the prelude is the Forsaken City, an abandoned city that is full of empty buildings and somehow still working stoplights. Forsaken City is a chapter that is designed to practice the movement mechanics of Celeste, exploring the concept of momentum with this chapter's gimmick, the stoplight blocks. The stoplight blocks are a block that will move along a path when they are touched. The player can use these platforms to their advantage by jumping off the platforms shortly after it stops to continue moving in the same direction, launching the player farther than they can normally move. This chapter is where the player can run into Theo for the first time, with him being in a side room. The player can talk to Theo and find out more about him and about Madeline, which will become more important in future chapters. The level itself is very empty, with little decoration, but it instead has only what the player needs for them to beat the chapter, teaching them with the decorations in the level design. The next chapter in Celeste is Old Sight. In this chapter, Madeline breaks a mirror and releases a part of you, or as many call them, Madeline. Madeline is the representation of Madeline's fears and anxiety, constantly stopping Madeline and putting them in dangerous and scary situations. The gimmick of this chapter is the dream blocks, which can be dashed into, launching the player through them, but removing the player's control while inside of them, killing the player if they hit something. The dream blocks require the players to plan their movements before completing a section, instead of just running straight into the level without any sort of plan. Old Sight is a great level that does an excellent job of highlighting how the mechanics of the game work, without being a distraction to the player. Chapter 3 is the Celestial Resort, an old hotel that is haunted by Mr. Oshiro, the ghost of someone who used to run it. In this chapter, Madeline decides to be nice and help clean the hotel, while Mr. Oshiro tries to get them to stay in the hotel, running into Theo along the way. Theo is escaping the hotel and trying to get Madeline to join them, but they refuse, stating that they are helping Mr. Oshiro. Once the hotel is clean, Madeline follows Mr. Oshiro to the suite, but when he tries to get them to stay again, Madeline comes out of the mirror and yells at him, breaking the roof. Once on the roof, they attack Madeline, eventually just telling her to leave. The main gimmick of this chapter is the sludge, which kills the player on touch and can move. The sludge requires the player to time their movements to complete this chapter, which is something that is very important in platforming games. Chapter 4 is the Golden Ridge, which is where Madeline runs into Granny again, who tells Madeline that they did not expect them to make it this far. Once the chapter is complete, Madeline runs into Theo, and they get on a lift. But once the lift breaks, Madeline starts to panic. Madeline showing up on the top of the lift, almost as a sign of them panicking. But Theo helps to calm her down, telling her a way to calm down, using a feather. This level has the mechanic of wind, which is used to reinforce the player's ability to use the correct timing, so they can use the wind to the best advantage. The Golden Ridge gives players the skills needed for them to fully understand how the game's movement mechanics work, and how to decide the best path to overcome obstacles. Chapter 5 has Madeline get stuck in the mirror world, facing monsters with lots of eyes, which are also parts of her. She eventually has to carry Theo while he is in a ball of glass, representing his phone addiction. This level has a very creepy atmosphere throughout, even before entering the mirror world. The gameplay for this level introduces the Seekers. These monsters with lots of eyes will dash into the player if they see them. The Seekers help the player focus on dodging obstacles that are moving, while still platforming, a skill that is particularly important for games like this. Once the player has a good understanding of how the Seekers move, the game gives the player a real challenge, while requiring them to carry Theo throughout the rest of the chapter, which slows the player down and makes them truly think about how they use the mechanics of the Seekers and Theo to open the door and complete the rooms. Chapter 6, Reflections, begins with Madeline talking to Theo at a campfire, eventually deciding she needs to confront Madeline, telling her that she does not need her anymore. Madeline does not take that very well, and throws Madeline down the mountain to a point that is lower than where she was at the start. After climbing their way out of the cave and finding Granny, Granny tells Madeline that they should try to comfort Madeline because Madeline might be scared. So, Madeline keeps going and decides that they need to combine their powers and reach the summit. The design and music of this level scream the fact that you are alone, and the game challenges you with a section where you have to face off against Madeline, requiring precision and knowledge of how all the mechanics of the game work. The gimmick of this chapter is the Feather, which is a short flight ability that forces players to move fast and dodge obstacles without running out of the feather. Reflections is the last chapter of the game before the final chapter, being the end to base game story. Chapter 7 is the last chapter of the main story. It is the culmination of all the player's skills throughout the entire game. But instead of being a point where the player learns something, this is a point where the player gets tested. Unlike before, Madeline is no longer afraid of their anxiety, instead accepting it and using it to reach the summit. Celeste has one of the best stories, tying it directly through the gameplay, with every level having a challenge the player faces also being a moment where Madeline has to learn and grow as a person. In the same way, this level is also where every mechanic that the game has taught the player so far gets brought back, being used in more difficult ways than they were before. The summit is truly where all the challenges that the players had to overcome throughout all of the game being worth it, rewarding the player for learning all of the mechanics of the game. Although Celeste's base game is not that difficult for avid gamers, the game contains a boatload of bonus content ranging from collectibles to advanced levels. While it is easy to overlook for many players, the bonus content provides a unique challenge for the player that feels rewarding every time. Hidden in every level, there are strawberries that require the player to go out of their way to find them, each of them having their own unique challenges to be collected. There are 4 different types of strawberries in Celeste. The normal one, which is where players have to find the strawberry to collect it. The winged one, requiring players to collect the strawberry without the use of the dash ability, or only using it at a specific time to collect it. What I'm going to call the seed strawberry, where there are smaller seeds of a strawberry having to be collected without touching the ground. And also the golden strawberry, which requires players to beat a level without dying. However, this strawberry only gets unlocked after beating all of the B-sides. Another piece of bonus content that challenges the player are the crystal hearts. If the player wishes to unlock Chapter 8, the core, they have to collect 4 crystal hearts inside of each level. To collect the crystal hearts, the player has to locate them and solve a puzzle which protects each crystal heart from the player. Once the player unlocks the core, the player has to relearn movement mechanics that are specific to this chapter. The core completely changes the core mechanics of the game, only regenerating the player's dash when they enter a room or collect a dash crystal, unlike before, where it regenerates every time the player touches the floor. This chapter also introduces the fire and ice objects, which change between fire and ice on the flip of a switch, launching the player when set to fire and becoming a temporary platform for the player when set to ice. The next bonus challenges inside of the game are the B-sides, which are harder versions of base game levels. They first need to be unlocked by finding cassette tapes, which are hidden in every level and require completing a timing puzzle to collect them. Once they are collected, the player can face harder versions of every level with new mechanics and a more advanced use of each level's gimmicks. The B-sides are difficult, however, they make the player feel accomplished once they can beat them. However, once every B-side is beaten, the final challenge for the player, the C-sides, are unlocked. If the player thought they were done with the game, they would be far from correct. The C-sides are the most challenging versions of every level in the game, requiring precise movement with no room for error. They are extremely punishing, and looking at all the bonus content, it is easy to see why the player has seen some of the most difficult challenges Celeste has offered. Except, they really haven't. The 9th and last chapter of Celeste is the chapter Farewell. Released as a free DLC update for the game, Farewell is the longest and most difficult chapter in the game by far, containing a whole new story and many new challenges for the players to explore. Chapter 9 is so difficult that it is recommended to try to beat this level after beating every seaside and collecting every crystal heart. The story of this chapter begins with Madeline visiting the grave of Granny, who we are told passed away, and Madeline explains antagonistically that Madeline did not go to her funeral. A bird then lands on the grave, and Madeline thinks that the bird must be a reincarnation of Granny and decides to follow it, leading her to space, where Madeline tells Madeline that they are on their own from now on. The player is back to having only one dash, and the first 3 sections of this chapter are where several new mechanics are introduced. These sections introduce these mechanics, but do not use them to their full potential yet. Not giving most players many issues, these sections introduce the pink dash crystal, which similarly to the regular dash crystal recharges the player's dashes, but also gives the player a second dash. These sections also introduce the jellyfish and pufferfish. The jellyfish is an umbrella-looking object that we can use to slow the player's fall. This object is found throughout the entire chapter and is a unique mechanic exclusive to this chapter. The pufferfish, on the other hand, will explode and bounce if the player hit it on the side, but will bounce if they hit it from the top. This mechanic provides unique puzzles within the level that make this chapter more unique. After beating the first 3 sections, the chapter begins to get more difficult. The beginning of the 4th section is where the crystal heart for this level can be found, but after collecting it, the bird flies past the screen, and Madeline decides to continue to chase it, even after collecting the crystal heart. This section requires a speedrun mechanic called wave dashing, used throughout the entirety of the chapter to reach higher and farther places. The rest of the chapter uses several mechanics that have been seen in previous chapters, such as the dream blocks from chapter 2, the wind from chapter 4, the lava and ice blocks from chapter 8, and the cassette blocks from the cassette challenges in every level. Every single section tries its best to use every mechanic to the furthest extent, creating the most difficult challenges that have been seen in the game. Farewell is the closing section of this chapter, but it is also by far the hardest section in all of Celeste. This section may only be one room, but it uses every mechanic to create the most challenging room ever. To complete this section, the player must play perfectly for almost 4 minutes straight to reach the end of chapter 9. However, by this point, the game has taught the player everything they need to know, and all the players have to do is complete this section successfully. While this section may seem impossible, is it a test that can prove the players that they have mastered the mechanics of the game, even giving encouragement to players who struggle enough. After chasing the bird throughout the entire chapter and almost catching it several times, the world breaking around Madeline as they continue to chase after the bird, they realize that all of Farewell is just a dream. Madeline, trying to prove herself, makes one last attempt to catch the bird, the final and most difficult challenge of the game has ever given to the player. This is where Madeline can truly make up to herself for missing Granny's funeral. Farewell is a culmination of every skill that the players learned throughout the entire game, and this section is the final test for players to fully beat the game. This chapter is without a doubt the most difficult challenge in all of Celeste, but it is also the chapter that feels the most rewarding. Of everything Celeste throws at the player, this chapter proves that the player has mastered the game. Farewell is one of the best platforming levels I have ever played, providing a great closure for the entire game's story. Challenge is one of the most key factors for why a game can feel rewarding, or can be a memorable experience. Celeste shows that challenge feels the most rewarding when the game teaches everything the player would need to know so they can overcome everything presented towards them. Every challenge that the player can overcome feels like a major accomplishment because they have struggled to overcome them. While challenge can make a game feel rewarding, it can also make a game feel more punishing, resulting in the opposite effect of what the game is trying to achieve, and the game being too difficult and most players just giving up. A game needs to ensure that every player understands what they are supposed to do so they can overcome every challenge they face inside of a game. Celeste does this by exploring and teaching the mechanics within every chapter of the game, and then challenging the player throughout all the bonus content found within it. Celeste is a unique game, trying its best to teach the player skills throughout the level design and using environmental details to highlight what the player can do to complete this section. From my observations about Celeste, adding challenge to a game is one of the best ways to make a game have a larger impact on a player. But it's not always a great idea. In order to do the challenge the proper way, a game needs to already be fun to play, and needs to make sure the players have the skills necessary to overcome every challenge. And not just that, but there are some players who despise challenge, so sometimes it is best to avoid making a game more challenging than it has to be. I always enjoy a good challenge, but most games I play that are challenging fail at making the challenge feel rewarding, and instead they make me upset instead of feeling fun. While challenge is important, never prioritize challenge over making a good game, because if you do, your game will end up an unfun mess that just angers people. Challenge is something that is difficult to do properly, and has to be implemented in such a way that it does not break the fun of the base game. And if that seems too difficult to do, maybe it just isn't worth the effort.